So I think everyone now gets the pop-up that our session has started. So now we just, oh, I see people already coming in.
Yeah.
That's great.
6 people come in. Yeah, great.
That's nice. So hello everyone. We're just starting up, so we're just going to wait for more people to join in. Then we start the session.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining. We're just waiting another 2-3 minutes for a few more people to come in. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the session on breaking patriarchal barriers, where we're going to talk about Empower Youth for Work's journey into social norms. So I'm Aisa Boudou, and my colleague Ronald Van Morton is beside me. And we're really glad to be here to present with you. So if you just bear with us, we're going to pull up our presentation. And please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat.
All right. I think you should be able to see it now. Yes, right, Lisa?
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, so yeah, again, welcome everyone. And as I said, today's session, we're going to be talking about how Empower Youth for Work kind of went on a social norms journey. In particular, a lot of the examples here are going to be from the Bangladesh and Ethiopia teams and the partners there. So as I mentioned, my name is Aisa Boudou, and I work for Oxfam Great Britain. And work on women's economic empowerment and specifically supporting that within Empower Youth for Work. And I'm joined by my colleague Ronald, so I'll pass the mic to him to introduce himself.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aisa. And I'm Ronald, and I work at Oxfam Novib, and I work as a program and learning advisor. And I supported Empower Youth to work with the social norms learning trajectory that we have gone through. And I'm also currently acting as the global project lead for the project since a couple of weeks. And I'm really excited to be with you here today. Just a quick note, I'm not seeing anything beyond the PowerPoint. I'm having it at my full screen, so I won't be seeing anything in terms of chats or whatever. But Aisa is keeping me up to date. But just for you to note that I'm a bit blind at the moment in this session. So yeah, today we have approximately a little bit more than an hour, and we're going to, as Aisa already mentioned, we're going to take you on a small journey, the same journey that the Empower Youth Work program has gone through over the past 5.5 years. And it's going to be a social norms journey. And we're going to have four distinct steps, if you will, that in perhaps any journey that you might take or have taken, you will recognize. The first one is that we're, of course, going to have our starting point, point number one. We're going to reflect together what are social norms, a very broad and open reflection, the same as what the program has done. We're going to get everyone on the same page, what social norms are, what they not are. And then we're going to zoom in social norms related to the economic sphere. Of course, Empower Youth Work focuses on youth employment, entrepreneurship, work and income. And the program tried to address those norms that can prevent young people, especially young women, from getting work, from being employed or having a safe work environment. So we're going to dive in that. Then the second step, a journey normally takes a compass and perhaps a map or a plan. So we're going to navigate the social norms, and we're going to dive into a social norms diagnostic tool that the program has developed and rolled out in Bangladesh and Pakistan to really get sharp what are the exact social norms that we're going to work on in the program. And then the third step, we're going to dive into the equipment and team. We're going to see how have partners, young people, Oxfam country teams, how have they interacted with social norms, what kind of activities, and we're going to look at also the changing terrain. Of course, like things change over time, as will be the case in every journey. And then finally, the fourth point, we're going to look at the final destination. After all the various steps, learning journey that we've taken as a program, where did we reach? And also now what? Because it's not perhaps the end of the journey, but perhaps just the beginning of a way longer journey that can continue in a sustainable manner. So this is the journey that we're going to take together, and we're hoping you will enjoy it. We will be presenting. There will be some exercises that we're going to do, and mainly, yeah, we hope you have a good time, learn about social norms, what we've done, and hear also from you your experiences with norms. So we're going to start. The starting point, what are social norms? So this is also how we started as a program, just the very basics, what are social norms? And we're going to do the same now together today. In a nutshell, it's the second point that you'll see. So norms, they influence us in daily lives. In our daily life, sometimes we're very aware of it. Most often, we don't even realize it, that we act or behave a certain way because of social norms that there are in society, but they play a crucial role. An example of a social norm is not a very tasteful example, but bear with me. It's, for example, like picking your nose. There is no law against it. You can do it freely whenever you want. But when you're presenting something or you're in front of a group of people or you're together with people, you won't do it. You won't pick your nose. Uh, why is that? Most likely because you will find it not so sanitary yourself. You will not do it, but also because you know that if you do it, the people that you're with, your community, they will not approve of it and they will frown upon it. And you'll face perhaps negative reactions. So you are very conscious of also how other people, your community, your peers, how they will respond to your action. And it can prevent you from taking a certain action. For example, in this case, you won't pick your nose because you know people will frown upon it. This is a very tangible example of like a very basic social norm. In this case, it's good because it limits, for example, that people freely, openly everywhere start picking their nose. But we also know that social norms, they can be very restricting. They can have a negative impact. Also, definitely on, for example, the area of work and income, for example, for youth, for young women. And we're going to now, just to start it off, we're going to have a small exercise. And that is the bottom of the slide. We're going to ask you a question. When have you done something because you felt socially motivated to do so, even if you didn't want to or didn't think it was right? It can be very general. It can be any idea that comes up, any example. But think back about your own life, your own experiences recently, or perhaps from the past. When have you done something you felt socially motivated to do, but you didn't think it was right? You didn't actually want to do it, but you still did it. We're going to have a small sharing session in the chat. So we're going to ask everyone to write down their example in the chat, but don't press enter yet. We're going to have a so-called waterfall. So type down your answer, but don't press enter. And then after 1 minute, when everyone has typed down their answer, we're going to press enter at the same time. And we see all the answers come in at the same time. So we're going to let's take 1 minute. Think about an example. Type it in the chat box. And then after 1 minute, I say go. And everyone can press enter. And then we have all the responses. So I think for 1 minute, but don't press enter. Type it out, but don't press enter. When have you done something because you felt socially motivated to do so, even if you didn't want to do it or didn't think it was right? And I'm looking inside you to also guide because I cannot see the chat. But
Yes, of course, I can read them out. But yeah, as Ronald said, just type it in, but don't press enter. And also feel free if you're struggling to think of something, it can be something very small.
it can be something very recent, perhaps even today, this morning, or this afternoon.
Yeah, it could be something like when you go out for a walk, or when you go to buy food, or when you're with your family or your in-laws, or your children, or at a school. So yeah,
Any example you can think of. And there's also no right or wrong, so feel free to write anything that comes up. And I think we'll have some time now. So hopefully you're all a bit ready. So I'm going to count down from 3 to 1, and then we're going to press enter, and let's see what comes in. So 3, 2, 1, and press enter. Let's see if something comes in.
oh yeah, we do have some things coming in. So great. I'm going to read them aloud for you, Ronald. And if anybody else still needs a little bit of time, this gives you maybe another 20 seconds. So, yes, feel free to keep thinking and press enter as I read. So, from Haroon, there have been social and professional occasions in very conservative settings where when men and women were physically separated in a gathering, and I had to oblige. From Carmen, open an Instagram account. Yep. That social media can be a powerful virtual world for social norms to unfold. From Miranda, pretend to pray on a dinner table. From Yazine, going to birthday parties. Similar to from Alice, actually, going to family gatherings. From Michael, greeting all my elders at a function.
Nice.
Fantastic. And do we want to wait
And
another 5 seconds, Ronald, in case any more come in?
yeah, exactly. And even if during the session, if you haven't been able to share yet, during the session you can simply continue to share. Let's wait for perhaps a few seconds. But these examples already very interesting, very tangible as well, and really showcasing the powerful effect also that social norms can have, really influencing your behavior. If nothing else has come in yet, perhaps we can move to the next slide.
We have one more from Bisharo. Wanted to talk first in front of my clan elders to present my thoughts, even though it's not allowed for women to speak first in this scenario.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much. Yeah, also very tangible. Again, something that you want to do or feel even right because you perhaps on that moment have the right knowledge you want to share, but it's simply, if you do it, there will be negative reactions, negative consequences, sometimes very big, sometimes small. But just showcasing like the very real effect that social norms have in our lives. Sometimes we're very much aware of it, sometimes not. And
And
just to
one
dive
more has
into,
come
oh, go ahead,
in,
please.
Ronald, and then I'll wait. But
No
please, as
worries,
he
no worries.
said, go ahead and keep typing, and we can catch up on them as we go. So from Bushra,
Exactly,
I had to wear a veil in a meeting room in a rural vicinity because there were boys present, and only the boys were half my age.
exactly. Another very tangible one. Thanks so much, everyone, for sharing. It feels like we all have a nice understanding, like of social norms and direct experiences that we can share just now on the top of our heads. And just to make sure that we're all on the same playing field, we're going to dive into briefly, just like the basics, if you will, of social norms, the definition and an example. And then we're going to go more into depth. But if you had to put a definition on social norms, the main thing that is always on the top is that they are collectively shared. It's a collective sharing. They're not the actual behavior in society. They're not also the sum of like individual attitudes or individual beliefs, but they are collectively shared perceptions that can quite often very much regulate a behavior that exists. And quite a classic example you will see at the bottom of the slide in the table is how, for example, behavior, beliefs, and norms can differ from each other. For example, if you move from left to right, you'll see individual behavior. The example of a man who, in this case, never helps his wife with housework, so the unpaid care work, the care work for children, it's all on the wife. The attitude of the man actually is that he himself would not mind cooking some nights in the week or perhaps picking up children from school, so he wouldn't mind himself doing it. But he also knows others in his community will think that he is unmanly if he helps his wife with the housework, and that is the norm that exists. So if you help your wife with housework, you are not manly. That can be quite a persistent norm that we can see in society. And you will see, so the belief, it's different, his own attitude, it's different from the actual behavior that we see. So in this example, the man acts upon the social norm in society. So he wants perhaps to help his wife in some instances. He believes that's right, but he won't do so because he knows that then his peers, his friends, they will not consider him manly, which makes him not help his wife. Very practical example. And if you further dive into the theoretical background of social norms, if you will, you'll have usually two scenarios that can really create a norm, put a norm in place. We start on the left side. That is a social norm. It can be in place because it's considered appropriate behavior in society. So an example is like, it is what I think people in my community expect of me to do. So really like your perception, okay, like people expect me to behave in this way. An example can be like in my community, it is seen as a positive thing for girls to marry before 18. So you think your community members, your neighbors, for example, if you are a parent, you think if I marry my daughter, for example, before the age of 18, community members will approve that. That is my thinking. I think that community members expect that of me. And you also expect if you don't do it, if you marry them at a later age, that community members, your neighbors, your family members, they will not approve. They will frown upon it, resulting in negative consequences that can range from shunning or like gossiping, and in some cases, even, for example, instances of violence. Then on the right side, it's a social norm that is in place because it's considered typical behavior. It is what I think people do in my community. So you expect your neighbors, your community members to behave in a certain way. Sometimes it's very visible in society. You see it actually happening. Sometimes it's perhaps more in the minds of people that it's not so much visible always, for example, on the street. It's more something, for example, in the private sphere and the household sphere. And an example here is in my community, men never help their wives around the home with cooking and cleaning. Another example of how, for example, an individual can think about how things happen in their community. In this instance, it can be quite visible, but sometimes it can also be not visible. It's really in the household sphere, and then it's really like in the heads of people. This is what I think happens in my community, but perhaps in reality, the situation might be different. But just to showcase, like, this is how norms come into place because of what you think the expectations are in your community and what you think that people do in your community. And it's usually like a combination of or like a gray area. But this, in a sense, is like what makes up a social norm. And then, of course, empower you through work. We're talking about youth employment. We're talking about youth empowerment, work and income. So we started, of course, to look at, now that we had sharp, these are social norms, we wanted to know more about, if you look at social norms, specifically in the economic sphere for young people, especially young women. So what we've done as a program at the start, it was around 2017, we invested in a so-called practitioners learning group in which we came together as Oxfam, different foundations that work on social norms, Promundo, but also private sector, for example, Mars, the Mars Foundation. We all did some type of work on social norms linked to economy, and we went to share amongst each other what is our experience with social norms in economy, how do we know how they exist, what kind of activities that we do, and through that we came to a couple of like more obvious social norms that can play a role in the economic sphere, especially for youth and young women. Examples you will find here in this little quadrant. For example, the unequal division of care work, linked also in the middle that unpaid care work is often not valued. So really like a persistent norm that places the value of paid work way above the value of unpaid work, which often also results in quite an unequal division. And it links also immediately to the gender roles. Usually the unpaid care work falls on women, young women, and not so much on men. There's quite an unequal division there. And for example, when it comes to paid work, at the bottom you'll see many jobs are often not seen as appropriate for women. So in these kind of examples, you see there's quite some strong gender and social norms that really determine how someone can behave in the economic sphere. It can very much be limiting, for example, because a woman cannot take a certain role because it's not seen as appropriate. Or because you have quite a burden as, for example, a woman or a young woman when it comes to care work. It prevents you from taking up economic activities beyond that in the paid economy, for example. And for example, instances of like traditional roles when it comes to, for example, early marriage or having children. And really, for example, seeing marriage often, the norm is here that when a woman gets married, it means that she takes care of the children, for example, no longer works or stops working if she is currently active. This came out, what we can usually see is like norms that can have really an impact on the economic sphere and when it comes to young people, especially young women. Now, these are quite high level in a sense, like these can be like quite generic still. So what we wanted to do as a program, as a next step in our journey, is to get way more sharp, okay, looking at the very specific social norms that we find in the communities that Empower Youth at Work works in. We want to get way more sharp what these social norms were. So young people and partner organizations, they went into the next step, which we're going into now, and that is that we went to navigate the very explicit social norms. And what we've done is that young people and partners and Oxfam country staff, they piloted and created and sharpened a so-called social norms diagnostic tool that really allows to deep dive, in a sense, in a certain community, what kind of exact social norms are at play. Beyond, for example, the more generic, there is unequal division of care work, or, for example, like there is risk of gender-based violence. We know it all plays a role. But how exactly, what are the drivers? And that is where the diagnostic tool came in. And this is the slide that really unpacks, in a sense, that diagnostic tool. We start at the left side. You will see three circles, and we're going clockwise. So we start at the top circle. The diagnostic tool, it started with really unpacking existing norms and gender roles. And how it did that, it really started with a group of young people and community members. They all came together and really started to discuss. If you look at your current community, society as a large, at large, what are the different roles in general that you see men and women take up in society? So really, for example, like there was a visual of like a picture of a man, a picture of a woman, then what kind of different roles do we see? So really like starting from the basics. And then more and more we dove deeper in this tool, this diagnostic tool, to understand, okay, like these certain roles that we see, why are they in society? What kind of like drivers are there? What kind of differences are there, for example, between youth and adults as well? And really to unpack and understand why are the roles, the role division based on gender often, why is it as it is? So really diving into, okay, what kind of norms are at play that drive how people are behaving in society. And then because we don't only want to know what kind of norms there are, but we also want to know what kind of entry points are there in terms of how norms potentially can shift and how the program can contribute to it. We went into two specific things. And the first thing is on the bottom right, going clockwise, exploring how norms have changed over time. So the tool went into also discussing, okay, like looking at the situation as it is now. Think back 10 years ago, perhaps 20 years ago, how has it changed? Because often in society, and it's the same for all of us, we see norms really as almost like a status quo. It's something simply that is there. It's like almost like an unwritten rule in society, but also it does change. And the more we are aware, okay, like actually, like if you think back about your life 20 years ago, you might have behaved in quite a different way from today. So norms change over time. They can change. And the more we understand it, and the more we see also the fluidity in norms, also the more opportunities for changing quite like some sticky norms that we see perhaps today when it comes to economic participation, the more opportunities we can find to actually change it. And the second thing, and that's in the bottom left, is that we dive with the tool into existing deviations. So seeing how, for example, certain behavior can deviate from a norm. Sometimes it's because it's simply positive deviance, like a certain family or individual can do something different because they are able to deal with consequences of like not adhering to a social norm, or because simply they don't care about consequences, but also because we sometimes see systemic instances where a norm deviation, going against the norm, is accepted in society. And the more we find those instances, the more perhaps we can leverage it to showcase, okay, things can be done in a different way. And the more we act upon these kind of examples, the better it can be. And the tool, very rich breadth of findings was found, and just some examples you will find on the right. Again, like these are examples from Bangladesh, by the way. Differences in the economic worth that participants gave to unpaid care work and paid productive work. Really valuing like paid productive work. It's more difficult often than what is said. It's more important, and the unpaid care work is often seen as something on the side that is not as important. And also like the burden that many women, young women, for example, face, is not so much seen in society because of that. Another example was that it was actually in this specific community quite seen as acceptable to harass women in public spaces. Like it's not frowned upon. So also that really can limit the mobility of women, young women, to move around, but also simply to become economically active. And another example was that it was quite acceptable to mock men, for example, when you conduct care activities that you can mock and, like, for example, like consider them less manly. That was another example that came out. The last example, the third point, that is an example of deviation that was found in Bangladesh in a specific community, and that is that it's acceptable for men to carry out a woman's, if you will, in quotation marks, care responsibilities when they are, for example, living alone, like they perhaps already have left their family house, they are not yet married, they live alone perhaps for a certain amount of time, and then doing their own care work, their own laundry, whatever you have, their own cooking. that's acceptable. Then like it's not seen as weird. And the same for example, when there is a sickness in the family, perhaps the wife is sick or other family members that usually take care work, then also it's seen as acceptable for men to carry out. So understanding more and more these nuanced norms and also these like deviations, the more we can sharpen our strategies and our work to really go into specific norms and leverage existing deviations. And we're going to, as a next step, what we did in the journey and what we're going to see now, is that if you know more and more about the existing specific norms, you can sharpen your strategies. You can way more specifically target norms. You can choose your strategies, your activities, and you can, in your very specific activities, for example, if you say there's a specific norm on care work that I want to address, a community dialogue, coming together with all community members seems like a good way. And then, for example, the content of the dialogue, you can really also include, for example, deviations that you found and really more and more make a discussion in society. Why are, for example, things as they are with care work? There are deviations. How can we place them, and why? And how can perhaps things change in society? We're going to play. Bear with me. We're going to play a recording from. You will see that the bottom right from Toshiba. She worked for Oxfam in Bangladesh for a long time, and she was the project coordinator for Empire's work. And it's a recording from a webinar in which she reflected how the sharpening of norms has supported them in sharpening their existing influencing strategies. Bear with me, I'm just going to get the sound clip here and we're going to listen to it right now. And Aisa, if for some reason it doesn't work, do speak up, then I'll try something else.
Which social norms factors do we want to work on? And then what are the key drivers for this, and how we can address this? So dividing in this based on the factors, we actually sharpen the first strategic issue on unpaid care work. I just give one example, like when we are saying that we want to bring more women in skills training and economic opportunities, then we try to look into like social norms, which social norms actually facing these obstacles. Like then we have decided to work on four. Like one is the all caring work, the perception I say that the people perceive that this is the women's sole responsibility to care the child. Yes, and then after the analyzing the factors and then drivers, we find out how to address those factors for the intervention, like which interventions we can pick. Then here, according to the example, we pick the couple discussion and also intergeneration discussion, because we found that when even some men are willing to share the care work intentionally or unintentionally, but sometimes they cannot do because of the shame that what the family members will say, what the community members will say. And then especially the elder member of the family, they are really scared of. So we try to do the design the intervention, like there will have couple discussion, at the same time there will intergeneration discussion where both elder and young members will be present. So
That was just a small highlight from, in this case, Toshiba, who sharpened, in the case of Bangladesh, together with young people, together with partners, their influencing strategy based on the sharpened understanding that everyone had on the exact norms that were at play in society. And just to end, like in terms of these strategies in general, like if you look at norm strategies and the ones you select, they like it's often like threefold that you can focus on in terms of your ambition. The first one is norms transformation. That is the perhaps the most straightforward one, that you see as with young people, with partners, like you see a specific norm in a community that you think this is actually very restricting, for example, in terms of how young women can participate in the economic sphere, how empowered they are to let their voices be heard, and you want to transform that norm. You want to shift it or change it in such a way that it becomes less negative for those consequences. A second one is norms correction, which is in the sense that we identify a norm in society that is based on actually wrong factual belief. An example, for example, an example, for example, is that I believe there was a study about like there was a norm in place that smoking, everyone thought in a certain context that everyone in their household or their vicinity thought smoking was good or okay, and like everyone was smoking. But like a anonymous survey showcased actually that less than 10% of the population was in favor of smoking, or actually engaged in smoking in public places. So there, like, there's an option to engage in a norm correction. There's a certain norm because people think society acts in a certain way, but you can showcase through, like, for example, figures from like a survey. It's actually not right. It's like there's a very different perception in society. So that's like a different way, like a norms correction. And the last one is norms modeling, and that's the most drastic, perhaps. That is introducing, in a sense, a new norm in society to perhaps balance or counteract like the negative effects of for different norm. For example, a new norm that if a husband helps with the household or helps his children with school or going to school, he is a good father. So that can be like a new norm that you try to introduce in the community, for example, through dialogues or through, for example, social media campaigns. So that's quite a rigorous, like introducing something new, a new norm, norms modeling. At this point in time of the presentation, but also in terms of the learning journey that we took as Empower to Work, we are at a crucial phase. At a crucial point, we've conducted phase 1 and phase 2, understand social norms and design effective strategies by knowing more and more about the exact norms that are in place. And then as a program, and this presentation as well, we continue with the third phase, and that is really diving into then the exact interventions, the implementation, supporting that, how can we get that more sharp. And that is what Aisa will now take forward. And Aisa, I will stop. I will continue to share the screen. So whenever I need to change and move, please let me know.
Okay, thanks so much, Ronald. Yeah, so we're going to go a little bit more into depth about the third and fourth points that we first saw in the kind of social norms journey and talking about, what do some of the local interventions. And so it's great that Ronald has really taken us into the idea of the different norms, transformation, correction, and modeling, because now we're going to kind of see some of the strategies that were employed by different partners. So as we said, whenever you're taking a journey, you of course always it's a team effort, and I think a lot of this social norms journey was very much led by local partners and country teams. So just wanting to recognize particularly Havayoko and RCDWO in Ethiopia and the Way Foundation in Bangladesh, as well as the country teams in Bangladesh and Ethiopia, because local partners in cooperation with country teams really are going to know the terrain the best and not assume social norms, which I think is a danger, and even kind of understanding from very localized perspectives within different communities, in the same region or in the same country, social norms can change. So that's very important to sort of have that comprehensive team, and even more so in terms of how much are social norms adhered to, what are the sanctions, what are the challenges. This very much happens at the local community level, so you really need to know your terrain and what does that mean. Who are the influencers in terms of social norms? Who is listened to, who is not? Who are the people in a local community who are break norms, or as Ronald was saying, positive deviation? Who is allowed to do that, and maybe why? What are situations that make it acceptable to break a norm? This is, and to use social norms technical terminology, this is a norm exception. So these are kind of really important questions to ask, and really having a local perspective and having a very comprehensive team and understanding local terrain and local norms is key to asking these questions. So next slide, please. So yes, as I said in the last slide, very much local partners and the country teams know this terrain. And so the question, I guess, that we want to answer and to ask is, how did some partners interact with this terrain? So it does take deeper investigation, and because as Ronald has said, social norms don't change overnight. So really kind of deep probing and careful community conversations, and these are sort of well placed to know and engage with leaders and families early on. As I said, And as Ronald has said, assessing appropriate behaviors, what is the level of flexibility to some social norms or the leeway that is offered, and really knowing that community landscape. So I just want to draw our attention to the diagram, the visual on the right. So this picture actually shows a very wide ecosystem of norms influencers. And these were some of the groups that Ethiopia and Bangladesh teams worked with. And actually, Ronald and I had the pleasure of conducting and facilitating a local facilitators workshop in Ethiopia, and the group had drawn some of their own versions of this diagram, in terms of there was some similarities and some differences, but it was helpful because they were really showing at different levels. So within the personal, within the community, the family, and going out broader and broader. There was a lot of different approaches taken to understand, to connect, to influence these major social norms influencers. So um, yeah, I think one of the key things, as Ronald has mentioned, was having community conversations. And we're going to talk a bit more about the different ways and levels in which these were conducted in Bangladesh and Ethiopia. But also to say that partners did this very early on, kind of already mapping and knowing this ecosystem. And they, from there, they had specific tools and activities that they used to engage the influencers and to physically start understanding where some social norms were more flexible or not, and how to sort of shift them. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so when we think about the tools and the kind of equipment, it's good to think about how did partners and country teams, how did they dig deeper into social norms? So I've kind of broken it down into two different types of activities, but we'll also hear a voice note at the end of this slide from one of our partners, and then you can hear it in her own words herself. So as we've mentioned, there's a sort of exploring and probing what are the social norms. And in both Ethiopia and Bangladesh, this was really important. So as Ronald had said, in Ethiopia, there were community conversations, and in Bangladesh, you heard about couples discussions, intergenerational dialogues, and youth groups. And in both cases, there were youth, of course, a focus on youth activities. And these were spaces to openly discuss, to probe, to start, and to initiate why and how social norms play out and how they can be limiting to young women's economic empowerment. And from there, we start kind of narrowing down into, we start from that, what are exploring these social norms, to what might be interventions to shift these social norms. And as Ronald has said, starting with that strong base of the social norms diagnostic tool and sharpening the strategies, that's what led partners and country teams into the sort of shifting activities, the specific strategies. So in Ethiopia, for example, they had care work practice groups for men, which were really interesting. Men would come together and bake injera and make coffee together, and they were attempting to help shift the acceptability of men undertaking care work, and to do this in groups so that we can lower some of the social sanctions around shame or around various forms of masculinity, and to kind of showcase, well, actually, this is norms correction. Men are equally capable of doing this care work. And in terms of from Bangladesh, we also had a really interesting example around home appliance training. So the Bangladesh team, this was a very complex and multifaceted strategy that they used. They had started doing home appliance training for young women in the program, but there was multiple benefits and ways in which they targeted social norms here, because although young women were the sort of primary target of the home appliances training, they also invited young men. And this was really challenging some of the norms around cooking and how to use like a rice cooker, and that men could also cook and help with, undertake care work. It also provided that time-saving labor equipment by introducing these appliances, which of course reduces young women's unpaid care work. And thirdly, it was interesting because after this training was over, young women were able to sell these appliances. And so that also challenged a norm around young women as entrepreneurs and being able to have a professional network beyond the home and to be able to go out of the home and to sell some of these appliances. So this was some of the specific activities and ways in which the teams dug deeper into social norms and started to understand, there was some flexibility, there was some fluidity. So Ronald, I think now we're going to hear a little snippet from Amina Abdirahman from Havayoko in Ethiopia, and she's going to tell us about there was a training on how can local facilitators talk about social norms and work on social norms.
Opening it right now.
I am Amino from Avioka, gender officer. What we have learned, it was a different module. It was two modules about module 1 and module 2, and we have learned about the social norms training. Through module 1, it was a training on the concept of social norms about such like a community conversation, and it was through different exercise that we have seen about in this training how to understand about the importance and key concepts and the role importance of the social norms. And also we have seen in different practical exercise about the experiences that we have seen in the social norms that we have been exercised through about what we have learned. And it was also other different also about understanding differences. It was under the social norms training that we have learned. So also we have learned about in module 2 about the social and about also we have learned about module 2 that is about module 2 talks about for the memorizing with the last of understanding of the successful strategies for the normal change. Also, we have make different pictures about the that we have seen and conceptual about what look is the picture we have seen at virtually. So we have also have been exercised about the current community race awareness. Also, we have learned about exploiting exceptionist norm, exploiting exception about the strategic useful to identify an exception, visible to breed. Also, we have also a practical and exercise about type of behavioral that we have learned. Also, we have learned about beating positive deviance. So I think that's what we have learned in the last minutes. Any comments concerning my voice? If under Balai, thanks for your comments concerns about the Gmail.
Thanks so much, Ronald. So yeah, there we heard from Amino, and I think something that I know that she and a few others were very, that you could hear there was a very strong focus on practical and strategic elements and talking about norm exceptions, etc. So we're going to move on to the next slide where we're going to talk about that more. So yeah, now we know a little bit around who was sort of with us, who was driving a lot of these conversations and activities around social norms. We're going to talk a little bit about, where are we now? As Ronald started off with, a final destination is we're looking back and we're thinking about where we are now. But with social norms, of course, we may have reached somewhere and then realize actually this journey has just begun. So some of the questions that were already being asked at the beginning or even the middle of this journey were, how do sticky social norms around young women's unpaid care responsibilities collide or block their entrepreneurship potential? So that was a big question. And you'll see as we look forward and beyond, that question around these unpaid care responsibilities came up very, very strongly and was raised strongly by Ethiopia and Bangladesh. And we've also heard about identifying norm exceptions and positive deviance shows us gaps and possibilities for norms change. So as Ronald mentioned, that idea of the norm exception of for young men, it is appropriate and acceptable for them to undertake a certain degree of care work when they're bachelors, and how do we kind of widen that so it's beyond a norm exception? Or how do we understand in one community where there is a family that shares the care work between the family members and between men and women and children? How do we kind of not only identify that, but also sort of leverage and exploit that, as Amino said? Next slide, please. Yeah, so there were some, coming out of this, there were some strong recommendations. And just to note, at the end, we will provide links to some documents. We're doing a kind of very quick overview of a very complex topic, but we have, for example, we're very happy to launch today an overview of some of the specific lessons learned from the social norms journey in Ethiopia and Bangladesh that was, made and compiled and based on the wisdom and insights from Ethiopia and Bangladesh, their teams and their local partners. So we'd invite you to take a closer read in that. But I just want to go over some recommendations that came up from all the social norms activities and research that the both teams did. So one was around framing around equal capabilities when addressing care work. So, talking in terms of norms correction, this is this idea that men and women are equally capable of addressing and undertaking care work. And a kind of recommendation and a tip from both teams was you need to anticipate that there will be a bit of pushback, or what happens if men do care work and then they're maligned for not being manly, or they're unable to do primary productive work, but really framing around, well, actually, men and women are equally capable, and having that norm correction and seeing, what happens. Point to this example of positive deviance where this man does do care work. So that's one recommendation. Another very important one is to focus on the acceptable behaviors rather than the typical behaviors. So in Ronald's example, he spoke to primarily, yeah, perhaps more patriarchal, acceptable and typical behaviors. But it's very interesting because in the work that the teams have done, and in for example, the training session that Ronald and I were doing in Ethiopia, there is actually a lot of there's a wide variety of behaviors, and that shifts from place to place and community to community. So, in fact, some acceptable behaviors may contradict the typical behaviors. They may not reinforce them. So, it may be acceptable in a certain context for men to do a certain amount of care work. It may be acceptable for young women to leave the community, to migrate and to be entrepreneurs and to be migrant workers. So really focusing on that acceptable behavior is key to making social norms change more viable. They found that by focusing on a typical behavior too much, it may actually reinforce, well, it's typical. This is how it's always been. And that's kind of the way you don't necessarily want to go in terms of a social norms approach, because that can actually seem as if every social norm is sticky, when, as we have said, social norms are actually quite dynamic, and there's varying degrees of stickiness to social norms. So a third recommendation was that youth active citizenship was key. What we mean by that is young women, for example, participating in meetings with government, public speaking in community meetings, and supporting young women and young men to do this. And this is really key to building confidence, skills, and networks for young women. And when we build networks for young women outside of the household, of course, again, that is maybe stretching some social norms that may limit women's mobility to the household. So that's very important. And lastly, a strong recommendation is having and creating these youth only forums and discussion spaces and groups, because this is where we allow new perspectives and opinions to flourish away from community sanctions, and to challenge the stickiness of social norms and allow for an envisioning of different futures. And when we talk about norms transformation, this is a key point, and was found in Bangladesh and Ethiopia. This is where, when youth are kind of with each other and thinking about, oh, how do I want to plan my life? What do I want to do? They start seeing things differently than what maybe social norms would say. So that's very important. So I want to stop here and do a little exercise, because I realize that both Ronald and I have been talking for some time. So I'm going to read aloud the recommendations again. And I'm really interested to see from the folks who are with us if there is one recommendation in your community or in your work you would say would be the number one to focus on. So, whether it would be framing around equal capabilities, focusing on acceptable behaviors, focusing on youth active citizenship, or ensuring that there are youth only spaces. So, these four recommendations. What I think would be really interesting is just to stop for a few moments and if everyone could take another read and pick one and just write my number one recommendation or I think this would be a strong recommendation, and to pick one of these and maybe to describe why in your context this would be what you would recommend or what you think might work. I would also say if you think none of these would work in your context or you have a different recommendation for a social norms approach, I would also invite you to do that as well. So yeah, we'll give it about maybe 3 minutes or so, right, Ronald? I think I'm,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's nice.
And so, yeah, I will read them aloud, and but please feel free to already start typing in the chat what you think your number one recommendation might be, or if it's none of these, what another recommendation might be, which is really interesting, and we can add that to the knowledge base. So the first recommendation is around equal capabilities, around care work. The second is focusing on acceptable behaviors. Third, around youth active citizenship. And fourth, around youth only, ensuring that there are youth only spaces. So we'll give it another minute or two. I recognize folks may be a bit shy, but just to reiterate that there's no right or wrong answer because, as we've said, social norms really vary place to place. We're just curious if any of these recommendations resonate with you or past experiences. Um, and I see Carmen has written, so I'm just going to read what Carmen's. So for her, my number one would be equal capabilities. I feel it gives a positive framing so it can provide a good environment for further discussions. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think that's an important point, Carmen, is that that was a finding from both Bangladesh and Ethiopia, is that you do need to do some positive framing. So although we're talking about breaking patriarchal barriers, there is that kind of future, yeah, what is the sort of positive framing around what is possible? And that's a great thing with a youth focus is youth are often at that period of time where they're thinking about their, what could be different for their future. And they're thinking slightly differently, perhaps, than people who are 10, 20, 30 years older. So that, yeah, that positive framing can be really important. So we don't just feel that all social norms are very sticky and that can feel quite, challenging and negative. Haroon is saying, I believe it's important to give young people the self-confidence to challenge societal norms. It is not realistic for a development project to change society or unfair and unequal social norms. That's an excellent point, Haroon, because that's a key. One of the keys that across Empower Youth for Work, that focus on youth active citizenship has many cascading benefits. And one of them is, as you say, is that they social norms may not change today or tomorrow, but that they start having that confidence to challenge them and to push them and to know that there is different ways of doing things and different social norms. That is truly what makes social norms change sustainable, and programs like Empower Youth for Work have a sustainable and long-term impact. Yeah. completely. Ronald, I know we're probably running short on time, and I have a few more slides. So please, everyone, keep thinking, because these are really great inputs, and we welcome them. So if you have more to say, please just keep them in the chat, and we'll save that for later. So I'm going to move to the next slide. Yeah, so in terms of taking another look and looking beyond, something that was raised, and I think now you've heard quite clearly, is this idea around unpaid care work being one of the major barriers to young women's economic empowerment. So some of the potential solutions and ideas for the future that both teams and partners thought up is thinking around what could a mainstreamed women's economic empowerment and care approach look like. Well, it could look like partnering with women's groups on childcare. So teams and community conversations really noted the absence of structural care facilities. So we're working on the challenging the social norm of women doing a disproportionate amount of unpaid care work. But one practical idea would be to really build the leadership and care services out from existing women's collectives. Another idea around what this mainstreamed women's economic empowerment and care approach could look like would be investing in the beginning with time-saving labor equipment and social norms approaches. So we've seen in the past where if you sort of introduce laundry or wash points, or you introduce some form of technology, that may reduce young women's unpaid care workload. But if it's not met with sort of conversations around social norms, and norms transformation, and that may or may not be permanent, and that may not actually address the underlying social norm, particularly deep-rooted patriarchal social norms. So both teams really suggesting and kind of noting that that is key to any future sort of solutions. And lastly, from Bangladesh, thinking around policy influencing for temporary parental allowance. So knowing what we know about unpaid care work and social norms to also change the broader regulatory environment. So we're going to go to the next slide. So looking beyond, these are just two big takeaways, but again, we're going to have the document to share with you. That's the real, it's a kind of quick read, but it's a really in-depth summary. So two big takeaways from community conversations and social norms activities showed us that one big one was that we need to build up and strengthen community networks of male support for unpaid care. So that was a huge finding from Ethiopia and Bangladesh, and something that, oh, bit of
Sorry, there
background
was
noise there.
a little bit of banging in the background.
And that is just very, very critical. And we're already starting to see, for example, in Ethiopia, some of these community networks are popping up. And this is very important so that we exploit those norm exceptions and those positive deviants, and we actually work on sort of broader norm transformation and norm correction, so that it is sort of seen as men are equally capable to undertake care work. And one of the second things that community conversations and social norms activities showed us, and this is a really interesting observation, came from the Ethiopia team, is that we need to broaden what is considered evidence collection at a community level. So social norms can seem, as Ronald said, invisible or just almost natural, but actually people need to see the possibility of social norms challenged and the positive social and economic benefits of that. So, for example, there was the idea from Ethiopia of having sort of like a walking tour of a community, and kind of saying, oh, in this household, both women and men are working, and they've got more livestock, and these are some of the tangible positive changes that we can see in this household. And this makes community members both key researchers to observe some small or bigger changes of social norms, and they're also witnesses to this social norms change, again, to show it's not inevitable. There are changes that are happening in your community that you may not be able to see unless we kind of really, dig deeper and place community members at the center of sort of being witnesses and researchers and collectors of evidence on social norms change. Next slide, please. So thank you everyone so much. We are finishing and wrapping up here, but we've got a few different publications. The one that I've referenced a couple of times is the Unpacking Norms Change. That's really great in-depth lessons learned and summary from Bangladesh and Ethiopia. And Ronald had also talked about the shifting social norms. That's more of a kind of broad scale macro look at social norms in the economy for women. And that's a really interesting read in terms of what Oxfam and others across the INGO, International Non-Governmental Organization, what they have found. And we also have a document with the social norms diagnostic tool if you're interested in seeing how do we start looking and diagnosing social norms. So I'm going to stop there, and that's good timing because there's a bit of noise. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending this session. We've left about 10 minutes for any questions. I saw earlier that someone had raised their hand, so yeah, please feel free. You can ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And I'm just going to, yeah, go ahead, Ronald.
Yeah, I think if we have a raised hand, most likely the team from Pickle Jar will need to support us in terms of allowing someone to speak, but also indeed like the chat, you can simply write the question.
I think that person has left the session. Like,
Okay.
The raised hand, okay.
Okay. I'm going to read the chat out loud from Bisharo. I would choose focus on acceptable behavior. So this is looking back at those recommendations. This is because it will connect people together to share a vision on the future they want. For example, we have acceptable behavior for international human rights. And acceptable behavior is like a guiding principle to follow. And in regards to the fourth recommendation on youth-only spaces, this is great. But I'm also thinking, for example, in Somalia, content, we see that when youths go back to normal spaces like homes, religious, cultural spaces, they end up going back to the social norms. That's harder for them to change easily. Probably working on both ends by creating this platform for youths, but also the elder generation and raise awareness on the changes made, then this can be much more effective. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, is that doing some of these recommendations in isolation without considering, what we saw in that picture, the different layers of influencers, it may mean that, it's going to be very challenging. And I think that's a really good point and interesting to bring up, Isharo, because in Ethiopia, a lot of the work that they did around community conversations, inevitably, actually, they ended up talking to a lot of elderly women, and older women also face a lot of patriarchal social norms in certain contexts. And one of their recommendations was that when we focus on youth transformation and youth entrepreneurship and youth as active citizens, in some contexts, we may actually want to do a dual approach, which could be really innovative, where we focus on youth and the elderly and bringing them together, particularly for women, young women and elderly women, and bringing them together because very different generations, but also struggling in some cases with a lot of stigma and barriers to mobility, to employment, to care work workloads. So that's a great point.
Just checking the chat and the Q&A, no questions yet. And nothing in the chat too.
I see virtual applause. That's great. Thank you. You know what I'll do, Ronald, is I'll just so everyone has it, I'm going to just pull up the links so that we can put the links in the chat to some of the documents that we referenced on that slide, so that the people who are here in attendance, you'll already have the links. So just bear with me a moment and I'll just drop those links into the chat box.
Exactly. And in general also as well, you saw on the Cite the Policy and Practice website from Oxfam. It's always a good resource. If you type in social norms on that website, you will find a nice load of resources as well. So also do check that out. And while Isa is copy pasting, feel free to keep asking questions if you have any, or raise your hand. Like, it doesn't need to be a question. Also, if you want to share your own experience, perhaps with social norms, feel free to raise your hand and you can be unmuted.
Just bear with me. I can only do one link at a time as it's a bit of a long one.
No worries. Yes, I see a raised hand. Carmen. Ah, perfect.
Am I now talking?
We can
Yes.
hear, yeah.
Oh, sorry. As you can see, I don't even know how I'm working with this tool. First of all, brilliant exchange. Thank you so much. I will put my camera actually. No, you don't see me. Sorry, no, I will not put it. I just wanted to, well, first, thank you. It is really interesting conversation. I was just curious. I mean, it's not about my experience or maybe the project in itself. I was just curious because when we were talking about different generations, how do we deal with this? Maybe it's a prejudice from my side, forgive me, but it's the um, young people. I see it that they want results really quickly. You know, it's like this eagerness to have changes happening one day to another. And when we know the social norms takes time and we will not see the changes on. So how do we keep this motivation going with young people when my generation, which I'm over 50, has passed the whole experience that change doesn't happen as soon as we want it, and we have to accept that, and we change maybe our expectation in that regard. How do we keep young people motivated when we know they are not going to see the result as quickly as they would like to? So how do we manage that? How did you do it in the project? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Perhaps I can give a general remark there, and perhaps Aisa, you have some insights from the learning document that we have from Bangladesh and Ethiopia. But in general, I think like social norms change indeed. Like it can take long. It can also happen very fast, as we've seen perhaps with the masks with COVID-19. But in general, it takes a long time. I think there, like the value of intergenerational dialogues for young people to, like, perhaps change doesn't happen right away, but young people are part of the process through, for example, these kind of dialogues, also with simply their community members, adults. I think that is key there in terms of like creating change, but also like making like young people driving forces of change and seeing there like the progress and the process, even if it takes slow, I think is important. And the second one is the youth only spaces. I think are quite key. So the young people also themselves, perhaps sometimes like it can happen there more fast. I think that is important. At the same time, also here, risk management and safeguarding plays a key role. Of course, like we don't want young people to take any action that is perhaps like so not accepted in society that it becomes a risk for themselves, for example, like a risk of violence. So also they're really working jointly with young people on that is key, and really making sure that young people themselves, activists and partner organizations, they have the full ownership of that. And that is key to make sure also that we have that element of risk and safeguarding really included there.
Yeah, I think you actually covered it pretty well, Ronald. But I guess I would add that point that Ethiopia had around kind of ensuring that the community are not just participating in conversations, but also sort of key witnesses to change, even if it's small, I think is really important. And that kind of showcasing that change takes time, but these small changes are already becoming visible. I think that's, you know, a motivating factor for youth, is that it does take time, but here is where you can see that small changes are possible. And in the learning document, we talk about the impact of role modeling. So we have some case studies with several young women entrepreneurs, and they play a really strong role in being those positive role models and being that kind of example of like, wow, look, this is a big change. And although it's at an individual level, it inspires others. And I think it acts as that inspiration. But balancing that that role modeling and that norms transformation with, of course, what Ronald has just said around what is the kind of safe, what do youth feel, and what is the sort of community norms and safe way in which to challenge norms, and to really listen and be led by youth on this. Great. Thanks for that great question, Carmen. And I have put the links in the chat. So the diagnostic tool, the document on young couples in good times and bad, which is actually more focused in Tunisia, the SEEP social norms roundtable document, and of course the lessons learned from Ethiopia and Bangladesh in Empower Youth for Work. There's a raised hand.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
I can hear you.
My name is Bishara. Very great presentation today. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to ask a question and maybe give a comment. One of the question is in relation to civic education. So, do you think it's a good recommendation in this case, because civic education teaches also more about acceptable behaviors and national values, things like that. This is something that we are, for example, missing in Somalia context, and I thought it's something maybe you guys can advise. And secondly, I wanted to talk about how we can break down these kind of norms. Because in Somalia, sometimes we have faced retaliation from, the traditionist or the culture, and also religious perspective, because they think that when we are trying to break this kind of norms, we are using the Western ideology or the Western norms. So this is very problematic, and it's also a barrier for youth, for example, empowerment and so forth. I remember when we were advocating for total abandonment of female genital mutilation, we faced retaliation and resistance because people think that we are forcing it on them. But there is a way that we can, change these social norms. For example, in Africa, whereby we can do it in a more, social way, in a more a way that people can understand. For example, not just totally saying we have to ban FGM, but how can we also offer an alternative to that, something that is more acceptable, but also something that can accelerate, economic and social development in this case. So these are some of the things that I thought maybe I would just add into it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bishara. That was an incredible addition and really, really important. Ronald, if you want, because I know we're almost out of time, I'm going to just take each briefly, but I think you'll also have more to add on. So in terms of civic education, yeah, I think that's a great point, and that did come up. I think it's really about understanding what will land in your particular context, like what will be relevant. So in certain contexts, that will be, a strong, that can be a strong tool to say, actually, look, the national legislation says that women have the right to free mobility and safe mobility and to work outside the household. So in some contexts, that will work quite well. So I think that can be really important, particularly if you're trying, when we look at that diagram, the ecosystem diagram, if you're trying to influence government employees or regional or provincial level officials, that kind of dialogue has been successful, working around, what is a legal framework, what is a regulatory framework. And then the second point was really important around what you were saying around FGM, and I think it can be seen as an imposition. That has been a pretty common critique and criticism, but I think it's quite important to kind of, as we said, really map out and take a lot of time to map out what are local partners and local organizations and community members saying, because you can find those individuals who have who are a bit flexible or who are doing positive deviation. And I think one kind of classic activity that I think both Bangladesh and Ethiopia have done, and others in Oxfam who have done social norms work, has been linking up very early with traditional leaders and finding segments of the Quran, the Bible, other scriptural documents, religious documents, where it does sort of say and suggest and confirm, for example, that men should not abuse their wives, or a good man should help take care of the family, and that could be interpreted as also taking care of the children. So that's a tactic that I think has been used, a strategy that's been used a lot and quite well to make sure that it's locally understood and contextualized.
Yeah, I think from my side, really great question, by the way, and addition. And I think you captured everything already, but I think from my side, indeed, like for the second point about like the risks of retaliation, like really making sure it's embedded in the local context, that is indeed key. And also there's examples from Pakistan where also like very sensitive topics on reproductive health, they were also like embedded, for example, like working together with religious leaders that were like champions in a sense, like favorable to the topic. That can be quite effective. And I think also like for every social norms strategy and activity, like really having clear also from the start, like your risk mitigation, like what kind of risks are there? How do we deal with that? Because in a sense, like all work on social norms, it brings inherent risks. We're trying to change something, so that's really key. Yeah, and making like really it embedded in like a societal dialogue, if you will. So it's like really like jointly exploring like a current situation, and then like building on, for example, like those deviations that there might exist, and exploring why it is, and like negative consequences of, for example, existing norms, and preventing that, for example, like you simply like raise awareness on the existence of like a certain practice and a norm, and for example like tell it's bad, as much as we perhaps want to do that, and like address like the topic head on, and like put really on the nose, like the behavior is bad, we need to stop it. It can be quite ineffective, but also quite risky indeed. So like really making it part of like a dialogue that like together we jointly explore certain behaviors, certain things in society, and then like explore the negative consequences, and jointly come to conclusions like how perhaps things perhaps have shifted over time, or can shift, or already are shifting in positive deviance. That's key. So building a bit on that. But yeah, thanks so much. It was a really interesting point and question that you added. And Ace is also writing something further in the chat on this. And I think, looking at time, I think we're out of
Yeah.
time. Unfortunately, we can speak forever, most likely. But
Yeah, I think we're out. So thanks everyone so much for joining. Again, those documents that we've referenced are in the chat. Apologies, the last one is Oxfam internal. So if you would like access this, no problem. I've put my email in the chat, so please feel free to reach out to me, and I can send you that document as well.
thanks so much, everyone, for being here and listening and inputting. Very exciting, very interesting. And yeah, I think we're going back now to the plenary room. So I hope you enjoyed that last wrap-up part of today. And thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And I think, Babu, you'll need to take us offline or put us backstage or something in that fashion. I'll simply mute now and